I was green and good.
What makes someone a good or even a great games master? I've already talked about what makes for a good player, but what is it that really makes for a good games master? A lot of what makes a good games master is fairly obvious. You should know the rules, and you should know them as much as possible. I mean, it's difficult to memorize everything, and you shouldn't set out to memorize the rules entirely, but you may surprise yourself and find that that does happen over time, especially if you stick to one system and only play one system. But, you know, that's pretty obvious. And you don't just have to know the rules from the Games Master's perspective, it's ideal to know them from the player's perspective as well, so you can help with character creation, you can pre-generate characters for brand new players so that they can figure things out or that they don't make mistakes. So you can help them and guide them through the process. So, you know, that seems fairly obvious. Know the books, have an idea where things are in the books, and also know the books from the player's perspective. The rules, certainly. Every minute little piece of background information you don't necessarily need to know so much, and a lot of games don't have a particularly set background, so you got a bit of leeway there. You'll learn these things as you go along, but it's good to have a basic grounding in the rules. It's also important to be fair in your application of the rules. If you make a rules call in one particular way, it's best to try and keep making that call in the same way later on. Players will have a far better memory for which way you said things could be done than others. This doesn't mean you can't change your mind, but if you do, you should have some sort of explanation, and it's important that you treat players around the table impartially, at least as much as possible. I mean, your job is to facilitate everyone having a good time. Most games don't set players up to be adversarial to each other, so you should largely be alright there, but you just need to be fair and not play favourites. So if you're dating one of the players at the table, don't give them all the powerful magic items, all the extra help, cheat to let them live, and so on. Be fair, be consistent in your application of the rules, and the opportunity to take a spotlight in the stories. Practice is just about the best way to learn, well, anything really. So the more that you play, the better you will get. The more you games master, the better you will get. You will learn more about the rules, you'll learn more about how best to describe things, how to create a mood or atmosphere at the table. I'll cover these things in later videos. And if you play with a regular group, you'll come to learn what style of games that they like, what kinds of characters they play, and so on. You'll be better able to anticipate how they're going to approach any particular adventure that you run or create. Still, as well as practice, preparation is important. Now, the really great games masters are masters of improvisation. They can come up with stories, they can come up with characters, they can come up with monsters on the fly so that you barely even notice, and so they can allow players to range wide and do all sorts, all manner of things. You know, this is one of the great strengths of role-playing, that it allows for all these different options and approaches and so forth. So that's good, but even seasoned games masters, certainly new games masters, preparation is important. If you're running a pre-done adventure, a module that you've bought or something, then the best way to run that is to have read through it a couple of times first, and to maybe make some notes in the margins or on some scrap paper about how you think players might do things differently to what's covered in the adventure, because no author can ever cover everything that adventurers are likely to do. If you're making up your own adventures, you can try and anticipate what they'll do, but you should always have some sort of reserve plan. Maybe you'll need to throw in some extra bad guys, or some different kinds of bad guys due to the makeup of your group or the particular magic items or whatever that they've got. So you can tweak adventures, or even if you're creating new ones for yourself, have some extra stuff prepared, some backup plans, just in case. You know, you might suddenly find that you need some extra bad guys, so pack a few extra miniatures, or take a few dry erase cards with stands for figures if you use figures. have a goodie bag of pre-generated monsters and things of varying powers and levels that you can draw on in an emergency and keep it in a ring binder or in a file on your laptop or something, so you can quickly throw something in when you need it. Preparation is important. Spare dice as well. Players sometimes forget their dice. A great games master has qualities that go beyond what I've already described. A really, truly great games master is able to improvise things on the fly. This is probably the key ability that separates a good games master from a great games master, at least in my humble opinion. And it's a skill that I, in particular, pride myself on. The ability to improvise and to make things up on the fly and react to what the players are doing in real time without too many pauses to flip through the rules book or whatever. There's things you can do that speed this up. I mean, some systems are much better able to cope with improvisation, but they tend to be simpler or more narrative-based systems that don't necessarily scratch that gaming itch for everybody. Fate is really good for improvising in. Feng Shui is good for improvising in. Games like Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, they're so rules heavy that it's quite difficult to improvise on the fly, but you can create tools that will help you. You can strip monsters down to their essential stats, hit points, how much damage they do, how easy it is for them to hit, any special abilities they have, and the rest of it you can discard if you just want something quick and easy to improvise with. You can make that easier, and the players don't need to know what you're doing, that you're pulling it wholesale out of your ass at the last second. They don't necessarily have to know that, and often your best encounters, your most memorable moments will come out of that kind of improvisation. And there's always the possibility that an improvisation will go wrong, so a great games master also needs to know how and when to bend the rules, to pretend to have botched when they actually critically succeeded, or when the big bad guy should have some kind of extra defense so he can finish his evil soliloquy before he's killed mid-sentence. These are also improvisational skills. Knowing when the rules shouldn't apply, knowing when they should. Characterization is important. Now, this is really difficult for a games master because they have to roleplay everything else except the players. Their characters, they can concentrate on, they can give deep backgrounds to, and they can devote all their time and energy to the portrayal of a particular character. Meanwhile, you have to play everything else, from the busty village wench in the inn to the vile sneaking goblin in the 32nd room of the dungeon. And it's easy to fall back on stereotypes and tropes, and there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. A plot, a story, characterization, and characters that would never pass muster in a Z-list movie will work incredibly well in a role-playing setting with players. You can even rip off bad ideas, bad plots from B-movies that hardly anyone's seen, and they will make for great and memorable role-playing sessions. There's just something more forgiving and involving about it for everyone around the table. When it comes to characterization, it can be a good idea to just give yourself a couple of sentence prompts for any particular character that they might engage with socially, and even monsters that they might engage in a shouting match with. So, you can just say, this person is always angry, something like that, and give them some kind of phrase or catchphrase or a way of talking, a tick, an accent, something that you can draw on to individuate that non-player character from everything else that's around them. I had, for example, in a cyberpunk game, in a setting where everyone was, or at least all the characters, were grotesquely rich. It was set at the very apex of edgerunner culture. I had a fashion boutique that was particularly catered to cyberpunks, armoured material and so on. And the proprietor, I just noted down as Jean-Paul Gaultier, but camper, and his catchphrase was, "I see checks." And he would always try to get them to buy things with checkerboard patterns and things. That was his shtick, and it made him a memorable NPC that people still reference today in other games where they're buying clothing or armor for their characters. So it can be as simple as that. Two sentences and you can make a memorable character out of nowhere. Accents are tricky. A lot of games masters tend to put everyone in this kind of over-the-top country bumpkin sort of accent for anyone in a fantasy game, but try and change things up a bit. You can also describe characters, or non-player characters, in terms of actors or characters from films. So you could say, you walk into the inn, the innkeeper is like that person off that series that we all watch, and that gives everyone a quick visual cue. So that can be incredibly useful as far as characterization goes. Great games masters are good at descriptions. Now, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to swallow the thesaurus, but accessing a thesaurus and seeing what kind of words, what kind of adjectives you can find that you really like, that really describe a scene, that's helpful, because there's so many different grades of subtlety in the panoply of adjectives which we have in English. I remember reading somewhere that English has more adjectives than any other language. So it is one of the most descriptive and rich languages that there are to use in writing or song, poetry, or in role-playing games. So make sure you use it to its full potential. And it can make a really stark difference to the mood and the atmosphere, and it massively increases your ability to convey the sense of a room that the characters are occupying when you do use language in this way. A dry explanation of a text might be, you enter a 10 by 10 room, an orc is guarding a chest. That only tells you what's going on. It doesn't tell you that much, really. Whereas if you say something like, the door opens smoothly, clearly it has been used quite a lot. You enter the chamber beyond. It's grey, cold, clammy flagstones, and at the far side of it, about 10 feet away from you, there is an iron-bound wooden chest, and squatting atop it, a Viridian goblin, who notices you immediately and turns his beady red eyes upon you. It's far more descriptive. It's best to try and bring in at least one sense. Usually sight is already there because you're describing what people can see, but if you can bring in a smell or a taste to the air or a sound, you can even play background noise if you want to better the ambience. You can even change the lighting in the room. Lots of people now have these programmable LED colour shifting lights, and you can use that to create a mood. But description wise, as well as sight, as well as the basic description of the dimensions of whatever it is you're talking about, it can often make a huge difference to talk about at least one other sense as it relates to the room, and that helps draw people in and imagine the space much better. It creates that theatre of the mind that helps people immerse themselves in what's going on. Another thing that's important is to be able to read the table. And what I mean by that is that you need to be able to pick up on the mood that the players are in. You need to be able to shift the game in the direction that best suits the overall mood at the table. If everyone's laughing and joking, it's probably not the time to make something super serious, to give it a lot of gravitas, to try and pull some kind of deep immersive horror moment. It's probably best to keep things light and jokey, throw in a few puns and references and things like that. And that, again, is where improvisation comes in. Sometimes players are at odds with each other with the mood that they want, and then it's kind of down to you to negotiate a space between, or to give one player what they want in one scene and another player what they want in another scene. And so it goes. Another good way to reward that and to encourage the mood that you want at the table is to reward players when they give you what you're after. One way to do that is to give little extra experience point awards. It doesn't seem to matter how trivial they are. People will chase any kind of reward like that you choose to give out. Or you can reward people for good role-playing. It's a rather subjective judgment, and be careful that you don't give it to the same person all the time. But little things like that, little reward, little tips. I've known some games masters give out sweets to players when they do something particularly cool. In some systems it's already baked in that it's rewarded, such as in Feng Shui. When you pull off a particularly dramatic stunt, you'll get bonuses on your dice roll. Things like that you can do to kind of reward the behaviour and the mood that you want present at your table. There are plenty of bad games masters as well, and there are plenty of mistakes that even good or great games masters have made in their past that you may want to avoid. Now, games master is a fairly British term. Game master tends to get used in the States, but also dungeon master tends to get used for everything, since that was established so strongly by Dungeons and Dragons. But there is a newer term that was popularised by the World of Darkness books, and that's Storyteller. Now, it sounds good. It sounds like you've got intentions or pretensions of creating a more narrative experience, a more artistic experience, a more ambitious experience around the table than just being the guy in charge of the dungeon or the game referee or whatever. But there's an attitude that was present before Storyteller, but was stronger while Storyteller was such a dominant system in the community. There's a problem that they take the tell part of Storyteller too seriously, and it's the games master telling a story rather than creating a story with the other players present at the table. That collaborative effort, where you're story creating rather than storytelling, that to me is the absolute sweet spot of gaming, where everyone is invested, everyone is moving to create the story, and the game itself exists in the interplay between the games master and the players as a whole, and they create something together, rather than the games master being, great leader or whatever, trying to tell everyone his story and them just kind of being along for the ride with things happening the way the games master wants regardless. So don't be a storyteller, be a story facilitator. As a games master and as a game designer, you're not telling the story, you're creating a space and a set of situations in which a story can emerge. Another problem, somewhat similar in a way, is the insertion of Mary Sue characters into games. A Mary Sue is a kind of self-insert character. They're usually overpowered. The term has been expanded out to cover any overpowered character. But in role-playing, it tends to be that the games master really wishes he could be playing, and so he inserts either his character and plays it, and of course they come up with all the solutions and solve all the difficulties, slay all the monsters or whatever, or it's some kind of NPC guide who is super powerful and significant. If the Lord of the Rings was a tabletop session, then the players would be the hobbits and Aragorn would be the Mary Sue that's inserted into the game. As a story, that works fine. In a role-playing scenario, it just really doesn't, unless you're really, really careful about how you do it. So in my opinion, it's best to just avoid the whole problem altogether. Another problem, particularly amongst new games masters, is that they approach the rules of the game as they would Monopoly or chess or something like that. They take them as being an absolute, and they never ever deviate from that. So they absolutely brutally enforce the rules, even when the rules are broken in a particular circumstance, even when they don't make sense, even when it would ruin the story. My favourite example of this is, well, I never started with D&D, I started with MERP, but the first ever D&D game I got into and played nearly put me off D&D for life. This is why I've always had a much broader interest in role-playing games as a whole. So what happened was I was playing a fighter because it was deemed to be the best kind of character for a noob, since they could take a lot of damage and wouldn't just die immediately. And we came upon this sleeping dragon. And I elected to sneak up, despite not being a thief, and I succeeded. And then I stabbed it through the eye with my greatsword. And the Games Master just said, okay, you do normal damage. And I rolled a 1. Because I wasn't a thief, you see, and as such I didn't have backstab. And at the time, I think it was Redbox, there weren't really rules for a coup de grace. They just enforced the rules as written, didn't improvise, didn't give me any assistance or anything. I mean, I even had to do a full to hit roll at the time. We were kids. But yeah, that almost put me off. So you need to be willing to sway and shift and change the rules and adapt them to the circumstance. Being an absolutist, enforcing the rules as they are absolutely written, as you would for chess, just doesn't work. Yeah, sometimes maybe the horsey should be allowed to move diagonally. Just sometimes. If there's one point I want to hammer home with this video to you, prospective Games Master, it is that role-playing games are a cooperative exercise. The Games Master might be in charge in a way, but they're not the absolute be-all and end-all. What makes really good games is the interplay between the players and each other and you as the Games Master. It comes from everybody, so you have to view every game as being this cooperative exercise between all of you. Everyone at the table matters, not just you. So be flexible, learn to improvise, read the table, to some extent give your players what they want, what they need, what they ask for, and you'll soon find that every game is at least passable, in the same way that even bad pizza is still pizza. Zang.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?